March 18, 1943, 11:42 p.m. Aboard the destroyer Hayakaze, positioned 240 nautical miles southeast of Rabaul. Commander Takeshi Yamamoto pressed his binoculars against tired eyes, watching the American task force through the moonless Pacific night. What he witnessed would shatter every assumption the Imperial Japanese Navy had held about enemy fleet operations, forcing him to write a report that his superiors would initially dismiss as impossible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The American fleet has been operating continuously for 47 days without returning to any base. This contradicts all known principles of naval logistics. Their fuel consumption calculations show they should have exhausted supplies 12 days ago, yet they maintain full operational tempo. Either our intelligence regarding American fuel capacity is catastrophically wrong, or they possess capabilities we have not anticipated. Through his careful observations, Commander Yamamoto had stumbled upon one of the most closely guarded secrets of the American Pacific campaign. For 6 months, Japanese naval intelligence had tracked what they believed were separate American task forces appearing and disappearing across the vast Pacific. The pattern made no sense. Fleets would vanish from one sector, only to appear days later in another, always at full strength, always ready for combat. What the Japanese Navy didn't understand was that they weren't tracking multiple fleets. They were observing a single, continuously supplied armada that never needed to return to port, sustained by a revolutionary system of underway replenishment that would fundamentally alter naval warfare forever. The supremacy of Japanese naval logistics had been unquestioned since the Russo-Japanese War of 1904. Admiral Togo's victory at Tsushima had demonstrated not just tactical brilliance, but superior understanding of fleet endurance and supply management. For nearly 4 decades, the Imperial Japanese Navy had refined their approach to Pacific operations, mastering the art of extended-range missions through meticulous fuel conservation and strategic base positioning. Japanese naval doctrine was built around the principle of decisive battle. Their strategy assumed that any major fleet engagement would occur relatively close to established bases, with both sides operating at the limits of their logistical reach. This assumption shaped everything from ship design to tactical training. Japanese vessels were engineered for maximum range and fuel efficiency, accepting compromises in armor and armament to achieve unprecedented operational distances. The combined fleet's war plans, developed through the 1930s, calculated enemy capabilities based on established naval principles. American fleets, they assumed, would be constrained by the same logistical realities that governed all naval operations. A task force could remain at sea for perhaps 3 weeks before requiring replenishment. Major fleet actions would occur when opposing forces met at the extremes of their operational range, both sides desperate to engage before fuel shortages forced withdrawal. This strategic framework had proven remarkably successful in the war's opening phases. At Pearl Harbor, Japanese planners had calculated precisely how long the attacking force could remain operational before requiring withdrawal. The attack succeeded partly because it exploited the narrow window when maximum force could be concentrated at maximum range. Similarly, the victories at the Coral Sea and early Guadalcanal campaigns had demonstrated Japanese mastery of extended-range operations. But by early 1943, disturbing patterns were emerging in American fleet movements. Intelligence reports described task forces maintaining positions far longer than Japanese calculations suggested possible. American carriers were conducting sustained operations in areas where fuel limitations should have forced withdrawal weeks earlier. Most puzzling, these same fleets were appearing in multiple locations across impossibly short timeframes. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the 3rd Fleet from his flagship Zuikaku, had been tracking these anomalies since January 1943. His intelligence staff presented increasingly contradictory reports. American Task Force 58 had been spotted near the Marshall Islands on March 3rd. The same force identification appeared near the Gilbert Islands on March 7th, then near Wake Island on March 12th. The distances involved made such movements impossible for any conventionally supplied fleet. Ozawa's staff initially attributed these reports to misidentification. Perhaps American forces were using similar ship configurations to create the illusion of a single large fleet operating across multiple sectors. But radio intercepts suggested otherwise. The same call signs, the same command signatures, the same tactical patterns appeared in each location. It was as if the Americans had discovered a way to transcend the fundamental limitations of naval logistics. Commander Yamamoto's report from the Hayakaze provided the first detailed observation of what would later be understood as the revolutionary American underway replenishment system. His destroyer had been conducting long-range reconnaissance when it encountered what appeared to be a routine American task force. Standard procedure called for observation and reporting, maintaining maximum distance to avoid detection. What Yamamoto observed defied explanation. At 0630 hours on March 18th, he witnessed two American destroyers approaching what appeared to be a merchant vessel. But instead of the expected cargo transfer, something unprecedented occurred. The destroyers positioned themselves alongside the merchant ship, connected by cables and hoses, and began receiving what could only be fuel while maintaining formation speed. The process continued for nearly 2 hours, with multiple vessels cycling through replenishment while the entire formation maintained its operational heading. Yamamoto watched through his binoculars as the Americans had essentially created a floating fuel depot, one that could sustain an entire fleet without requiring any interruption to combat operations. His initial reaction was disbelief. Naval vessels had always required port facilities for major replenishment. The complex process of fuel transfer, ammunition loading, and crew rotation demanded the stability and infrastructure of an established base. What he was witnessing suggested the Americans had solved technical problems that Japanese naval engineers considered impossible. The merchant vessel serving as the replenishment ship was unlike anything in Japanese experience. Later intelligence would identify it as one of the new Cimarron-class fleet oilers, purpose-built for underway refueling operations. These vessels could carry over 140,000 barrels of fuel oil, enough to completely refuel multiple destroyers or significantly extend the range of larger warships. But the technical achievement went beyond simple fuel capacity. The Americans had developed a sophisticated system of tensioned cables and flexible hoses that allowed fuel transfer while both vessels maintained formation speed. This required precise navigation, advanced pump systems, and specially trained crews capable of coordinating complex operations in potentially hostile waters. Yamamoto noted in his report that the American formation never broke stride. While individual vessels cycled through replenishment, the task force maintained its tactical disposition and operational tempo. Combat air patrols continued overhead, screening destroyers maintained their positions, and the formation's anti-submarine measures never relaxed. It was as if they had discovered a way to eliminate the traditional vulnerability period associated with logistics operations. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means the implications were staggering. If American fleets could refuel at sea without returning to port, they could maintain continuous pressure across the entire Pacific. Traditional Japanese strategy relied on the assumption that enemy forces would eventually be forced to withdraw for replenishment, creating opportunities for Japanese counterattack. But a fleet that never withdrew presented an entirely different strategic challenge. Japanese naval intelligence had completely missed the development of American underway replenishment capabilities. While Japanese engineers had focused on maximizing individual ship range and fuel efficiency, American designers had taken a fundamentally different approach. Instead of making each ship more self-sufficient, they had created a system where the fleet itself became self-sustaining. The concept had its origins in American industrial philosophy. Rather than accepting constraints, American engineers sought to eliminate them entirely. If fuel limitations restricted fleet operations, then develop a way to refuel at sea. If ammunition shortages limited sustained combat, then create underway ammunition transfer systems. The approach required massive industrial investment and complex technological development, but it promised to revolutionize naval warfare. Development of the underway replenishment system had begun in earnest following Pearl Harbor. American naval planners recognized that victory in the Pacific would require sustained operations across vast distances. Traditional port-based logistics would never support the tempo of operations necessary to defeat Japan. The solution required nothing less than recreating port facilities at sea. The technical challenges were enormous. Fuel transfer between moving vessels required pump systems capable of overcoming the pressure differentials created by ship movement. Hose connections had to remain secure despite the constant motion of both vessels. Most critically, the entire process had to be completed quickly enough to minimize vulnerability while maintaining the precision necessary to prevent catastrophic accidents. American engineers approached each problem systematically. The pump systems used high-pressure centrifugal pumps mounted on shock-absorbing foundations to compensate for ship movement. Fuel hoses were constructed with multiple layers of reinforced rubber and steel wire, designed to stretch and flex without breaking connection under the stress of ocean swells. Connection systems used quick disconnect fittings that could be secured and released rapidly even in rough seas. The training requirements were equally demanding. Crews had to master the complex choreography of bringing vessels alongside each other at sea, maintaining precise distances and speeds while transferring thousands of gallons of volatile fuel. A single error could result in collision, fire, or explosion. The margin for error was virtually non-existent, yet the Americans had somehow made the process routine. By March 1943, when Commander Yamamoto witnessed his first underway replenishment, American fleets had been using the system for nearly 6 months. What appeared impossible to Japanese observers had become standard operating procedure for American naval forces. Task Force 58 could remain at sea indefinitely, sustained by a logistics train that followed the fleet rather than requiring the fleet to return to established bases. The psychological impact on Japanese naval planning was immediate and profound. Every assumption about American operational limitations had to be reconsidered. Fleet movements that had seemed impossible were not only possible but routine. American task forces could appear anywhere in the Pacific, remain as long as necessary, and withdraw only when tactical conditions demand rather than when fuel gauges required. Commander Yamamoto's report reached Admiral Ozawa's headquarters 3 days after the initial observation. The intelligence staff's first reaction was skepticism. The described operations contradicted fundamental principles of naval logistics that had governed warfare for centuries. Ships required ports for major replenishment. This was not opinion, but physical law, as immutable as the need for ammunition or food. But Yamamoto's credentials were impeccable. He had graduated from the Naval Academy at Etajima with honors, served with distinction in the China incident, and commanded destroyer operations throughout the early Pacific campaigns. His technical knowledge was beyond question, and his reputation for accurate reporting was well established. If Commander Yamamoto reported witnessing underway fuel transfer, then something unprecedented had occurred. The implications were so significant that Admiral Ozawa ordered independent verification. Additional reconnaissance missions were dispatched to locate and observe American task forces, specifically looking for evidence of the described replenishment operations. Within 2 weeks, 3 separate Japanese units had reported similar observations, confirming that the Americans had indeed developed systematic underway replenishment capabilities. The strategic revolution was undeniable. American fleets operating with underway replenishment could maintain continuous presence in any sector of the Pacific. Traditional Japanese defensive strategies relied on the assumption that enemy forces would eventually be forced to withdraw, creating opportunities for counterattack. But fleets that never withdrew presented an entirely different challenge, one for which Japanese naval doctrine had no answer. The technical details of American underway replenishment would remain partially mysterious to Japanese intelligence throughout the war. While they could observe the general process, the specific equipment, procedures, and capabilities remained classified at the highest levels. Japanese engineers attempted to develop similar systems, but without understanding the fundamental design principles, their efforts produced only limited results. What Commander Yamamoto had witnessed on that moonless night in March 1943 was more than a technical innovation. It was the beginning of a new era in naval warfare, one where logistical constraints no longer governed operational possibilities. The fleet that never returned to port had broken the traditional rules of naval combat, creating advantages that would prove decisive in the battles to come. The revolution in American naval logistics had begun 2 years earlier in the industrial shipyards of Newport News and Bethlehem Steel, where engineers were designing vessels that would fundamentally alter the nature of oceanic warfare. The USS Neosho, launched in April 1939, represented the first generation of purpose-built fleet oilers designed specifically for underway replenishment operations. Unlike traditional tankers that required port facilities for fuel transfer, the Neosho incorporated revolutionary pumping systems and specialized rigging designed to sustain combat fleets at sea indefinitely. The concept emerged from hard lessons learned during the Atlantic convoy battles, where German U-boats had demonstrated the vulnerability of traditional supply lines. American naval planners recognized that victory in the Pacific would require sustained operations across distances that dwarfed European theaters. The solution demanded nothing less than recreating the logistical infrastructure of major naval bases aboard mobile platforms that could follow the fleet wherever combat demanded. Robert Morrison, chief engineer at the Navy's Bureau of Ships, had spent 18 months developing the technical specifications for what would become the Cimarron-class fleet oilers. The challenge was creating vessels capable of transferring fuel, ammunition, and supplies while maintaining fleet speed in potentially hostile waters. Traditional cargo operations required stationary vessels in protected harbors, but Pacific warfare demanded the ability to sustain fleets during extended combat operations far from any friendly port. Robert Morrison, chief engineer at the Navy's Bureau of Ships, had spent 18 months developing the technical specifications for what would become the Cimarron-class fleet oilers. The challenge was creating vessels capable of transferring fuel, ammunition, and supplies while maintaining fleet speed in potentially hostile waters. Traditional cargo operations required stationary vessels in protected harbors, but Pacific warfare demanded the ability to sustain fleets during extended combat operations far from any friendly port. Robert Morrison, chief engineer at the Navy's Bureau of Ships, had spent 18 months developing the technical specifications for what would become the Cimarron-class fleet oilers. The challenge was creating vessels capable of transferring fuel, ammunition, and supplies while maintaining fleet speed in potentially hostile waters. Traditional cargo operations required stationary vessels in protected harbors, but Pacific warfare demanded the ability to sustain fleets during extended combat operations far from any friendly port. The background operations were massive. Tanker movements rapidly followed the fleet, performing 2 to 3 drafts behind the main fleet to maintain sightline of fuel transfer. The engineering breakthrough came in the form of tension transfer systems that could accommodate the constant motion of vessels at sea. Morrison's team developed high-capacity pumps mounted on gyroscopic stabilizers that maintained consistent pressure despite ship movement. The fuel hoses themselves were revolutionary, constructed with multiple layers of reinforced synthetic rubber surrounding steel wire cores that could stretch and flex without breaking connection under the stress of ocean swells. The training requirements were equally demanding. Crews had to master the complex choreography of bringing vessels alongside each other at sea, maintaining precise distances and speeds while transferring thousands of volatile fuel. A single error could result in collision, fire, or explosion. The margin for error was virtually non-existent, yet the Americans had somehow made the process routine. By March 1943, when Commander Yamamoto witnessed his first underway replenishment, American fleets had been using the system for nearly 6 months. What appeared impossible to Japanese observers had become... Most critically, the entire system was designed for rapid deployment and disconnection. In combat zones, vulnerability during replenishment operations could prove catastrophic. The American system could establish fuel transfer within minutes and complete disconnection in under 30 seconds if enemy contact required immediate evasive action. This speed was achieved through innovative quick-connect couplings that maintained secure seals while allowing instant separation. By January 1943, 12 Cimarron-class oilers were operating with American Pacific fleets, each capable of carrying 146,000 barrels of fuel oil along with aviation gasoline, diesel fuel, and lubricants necessary to sustain an entire task force. The vessels incorporated defensive armament sufficient to protect themselves during transfer operations, including dual-purpose 5-inch guns and multiple anti-aircraft batteries. They were not merely supply ships, but integral combat units designed to operate in hostile waters. The tactical employment of underway replenishment required completely new operational procedures. Traditional naval formations positioned the most valuable vessels at the center with escorts arranged in protective screens. But replenishment operations demanded that valuable fleet units approach vulnerable supply ships, creating tactical challenges that required innovative solutions. Admiral William Halsey's staff developed the standard procedures that became known as alongside replenishment, where destroyers and cruisers would approach the oiler from specific angles while maintaining formation speed. The receiving vessel would match course and speed with the supply ship, gradually closing to a distance of approximately 120 feet. At this range, specially trained gun crews would fire messenger lines across the gap, followed by heavier cables capable of supporting fuel hoses and cargo transfers. The precision required was extraordinary. Both vessels had to maintain exact speeds and courses while ocean swells constantly changed their relative positions. Helmsmen required exceptional skill to keep their ships in the narrow corridor where transfer was possible without risking collision. A deviation of more than 20 feet could snap transfer cables, while closing too rapidly could result in catastrophic impact between vessels displacing thousands of tons. Weather conditions significantly affected replenishment operations, but American procedures had been developed to function in all but the most severe sea states. During moderate swells, experienced crews could complete fuel transfer in less than 2 hours per vessel. In rough conditions, the process required additional time and greater risk, but remained feasible when tactical conditions demanded sustained operations. The ammunition transfer systems represented an even greater technical achievement. Unlike fuel, which could be pumped through flexible hoses, ammunition required physical transfer of heavy projectiles and explosive charges. American engineers developed highline transfer systems using reinforced cables suspended between vessels, with motorized pulleys capable of moving ammunition containers across the gap between ships. These transfers were conducted with extraordinary care, as a single accident could destroy both vessels. Ammunition containers were secured with multiple safety systems and transferred individually to minimize risk. The process was slower than fuel replenishment, but allowed fleets to sustain prolonged combat operations without returning to port for rearming. The Japanese Navy's first systematic analysis of American underway replenishment capabilities began in April 1943, following multiple confirmed observations by reconnaissance units. Captain Minoru Yokota, assigned to the Combined Fleet Intelligence Staff, was tasked with determining the extent and implications of American logistics capabilities. His investigation would reveal the magnitude of American industrial achievement and the obsolescence of traditional Japanese naval strategy. Yokota's team analyzed intercepted American radio communications, examined debris recovered from damaged supply vessels, and interviewed prisoners of war who had served aboard fleet oilers. The picture that emerged was of a logistics system operating on a scale that Japanese planners had considered impossible. American task forces were being sustained not by occasional emergency refueling, but by systematic, routine replenishment operations that had become standard procedure. The intelligence analysis revealed that American fleet oilers were operating on predetermined schedules, meeting task forces at designated coordinates to provide comprehensive resupply services. These operations included not only fuel transfer, but complete rearming, fresh provisions, mail delivery, medical supplies, and even personnel transfers. The Americans had created mobile naval bases that could support indefinite operations anywhere in the Pacific. Most shocking was the scale of the American logistics fleet. Intelligence estimates suggested that over 30 specialized replenishment vessels were operating in Pacific waters, with additional ships entering service monthly. This represented an industrial commitment that dwarfed Japanese capabilities and demonstrated American determination to sustain combat operations regardless of distance from established bases. The strategic implications were overwhelming. Japanese defensive strategy relied on forcing American fleets to operate at the extremes of their logistical reach, where fuel limitations would eventually compel withdrawal. But fleets capable of indefinite replenishment at sea could maintain pressure continuously, never providing the respite that Japanese forces required for reinforcement and resupply of their own positions. Japanese naval engineers attempted to develop similar capabilities, but the industrial requirements exceeded available resources. Building fleet oilers required specialized steel alloys, advanced pumping systems, and precision manufacturing capabilities that were already stretched beyond capacity producing combat vessels. The complex training required for replenishment operations demanded experienced personnel who were desperately needed for frontline combat duties. More fundamentally, Japanese ship design philosophy emphasized individual vessel capabilities rather than fleet-level logistics systems. Japanese destroyers and cruisers achieved exceptional range through fuel-efficient engines and austere crew accommodations, but they lacked the standardized fittings and procedures necessary for routine underway replenishment. Retrofitting existing vessels would require extensive modifications that could not be completed while maintaining operational tempo. The psychological impact on Japanese naval personnel was as significant as the strategic implications. For 40 years, Japanese naval training had emphasized endurance, efficiency, and maximum utilization of limited resources. These values had created a naval force capable of achieving remarkable results with minimal logistic support. But facing an enemy with seemingly unlimited endurance challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying Japanese naval culture. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Hayashi, serving aboard the heavy cruiser Kumano, recorded his observations in a personal diary that would be captured following the vessel's sinking in November 1944. His entries document the growing demoralization among Japanese naval personnel as they realized the extent of American logistics capabilities. "The Americans appear whenever they choose and remain as long as necessary," Hayashi wrote. "Our calculations of their fuel consumption prove meaningless when they never seem to require replenishment. We plan our operations assuming they must withdraw, but they never withdraw. It is as if they have transformed the entire Pacific into their home waters while we become strangers in our own domain." The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 would demonstrate the decisive advantage provided by underway replenishment. American Task Force 58, operating continuously for over 2 months without returning to port, maintained full combat effectiveness throughout the engagement, while Japanese forces, limited by traditional logistics constraints, were forced to operate at the extremes of their fuel capacity. The result was not merely tactical defeat, but the collapse of Japanese naval aviation as an effective fighting force. Statistical analysis conducted by Japanese naval intelligence in late 1944 revealed the mathematical impossibility of competing with American logistics capabilities. American fleets were maintaining operational tempos that required fuel consumption rates 300% higher than Japanese vessels could sustain. This difference was not explained by inefficiency, but by the fundamental capability to operate without regard to fuel conservation, knowing that replenishment was always available. The captured intelligence documents from this period show Japanese recognition that they were facing not merely superior numbers or technology, but an entirely different approach to naval warfare. American forces had eliminated logistical constraints that had governed naval operations for centuries, creating capabilities that traditional naval strategy could not counter. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.